Good evening, I'm Isaac BenEzra, producer and host of Conversations. It's good to be with you again. Tonight we're going to go on a freedom ride that began in New Orleans, Louisiana, with one of the original riders, Jean. Welcome.
Thank you.
Jean Denton-Thompson. That's part of my aging process. We'll get used to that.
Oh, I'm getting there.
Jean, at age 19, was on one of the rides, and this is what Jean looked like then. This is where was this taken?
Jackson, Mississippi.
This is getting off the bus.
Yes.
The first time.
Yes.
We're going to talk about that ride that made history. Why don't you start, Jean, by telling us first what it was like to be 19 in New Orleans in 1960?
When I was 19, living in New Orleans, I was part of what we call it the movement, the civil rights movement. We just shortened it to the movement. And I was a member of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And my regular day was to wake up, get some money, to get some car fare, go down to Canal Street, which was the major street in New Orleans, and picket, because we were trying to get the lunch counters open to everybody and jobs for everyone, because the lunch counters were segregated. We could not work in any of the stores downtown unless you were a janitor or something like that. So that was my life at 19. And when the freedom rides first got started in Washington, D.C., and it was supposed to go from Washington, D.C. and to New Orleans, and I think they were supposed to have done it in about 2 weeks' time. But when they got down to Amherst, Alabama, the first bus was, there were two buses that left out of Washington, D.C. The first bus got bombed in Amherst, and the second bus went on to Foreman, Alabama, and that bus got bombed, got mobbed, and the people just decided, the National Corps decided that the people would fly from Montgomery and into New Orleans, where we had a mass rally. And there was students in Tennessee who decided that they were from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Organization. I think.
Coordinating committee, something.
Yeah, like coordinating. Well, anyway, they decided they were going to continue it on to the next stage. At the same time, some of us in New Orleans, CORE, decided we wanted to continue it also. So we left from New Orleans and went to Montgomery, Alabama. And I think there were 5 of us who left from New Orleans to continue the freedom rides from Montgomery. That's where we joined up with the people from SNCC.
And then you went to the lunch counters and the bus terminal?
Yeah, it was decided at that time that we were going to, well, the people in CORE and SNCC and the leadership had decided, along with Robert Kennedy, that we would just go straight from Montgomery to Jackson, Mississippi. And by doing that, we weren't going to stop at any other places to test the ICC. And then
that's the state rules on.
Yeah, the Interstate Commerce Commission, okay, that decided to desegregate all everything that had anything to do with interstate transportation, like buses, trains, and airports, that had to be integrated. So we were testing that. And so it was decided when we got to the bus depot that, hey, we are here, so why don't we just sit down at the lunch counter? So that was the first time the lunch counters in Montgomery were desegregated. And we had lunch right before we got on the Trailway bus to Jackson. And
what kind of response did you get when you started that activity there?
When I first got to Montgomery, got off the train and stepped off the train and was greeted by National Guards. By that time, National Guards were called out to protect people because I think the National Guards had to, the night before that we got there, there was a mass rally with King and a lot of leaders in the movement were trapped in this church. So they called out the National Guards. And so when we got off the train, the National Guards were there. And they had fixed bayonets. And that was extremely frightening and at the same time disappointing and dismayed that in order for people who happen to be black, we were called Negroes at the time, in order for us to have any type of freedom, we exercise our freedom to sit down and have a cup of coffee or something like that. You had to call out the National Guards to protect us. And so that's what I was faced with when I first got off the train. And then when I stepped out of the bus depot, and then you looked around and you saw nothing but National Guards all over, and they were on top of the buildings. And you get into your cars, and wherever you drove, there were National Guards and Jeeps in the front of your car and the back of your car, and the people who housed us, there were National Guards all around, and Secret Service people all around also. So that's the type of greeting I got in Montgomery.
What happened after that?
Oh, we stayed in Montgomery for, I think, 2 or 3 days, thinking about what should be done next. And I think there were negotiations with Robert Kennedy as to what we should be doing with King and James Farmer and people from SNCC. And the decision was made that we would get on 2 buses, and one would be a Trailway and one would be a Greyhound bus. I was on a Trailway bus, which was the first bus that left Montgomery, Alabama. So we got on the buses, and there were, must have been 11 of us, Freedom Riders, both black and white, men and women, and several National Guards and a lot of news people. So we got on the bus and drove, and there were soldiers, National Guards all along the highway, and there was supposed to have been a bomb scare, so they were checking that out. And they hadn't thought about what to do with us if we had to have used the restrooms. So C.T. Vivian and James Lowndes, Reverends, they're both ministers, they were able to negotiate with the National Guards that they should stop someplace, and which they did do. And we drove, after that happened, we just drove to Jackson, Mississippi. I we got off the bus. I went into the waiting room, and when I got to the waiting room, I went to the right, and
You went to?
I went to my right in the white waiting room, and I was asked, "What are you going to do?" Can't remember. Well, anyway, what it amounted to, I was arrested for breaching the peace.
Was this pretty much the scene?
That was the scene when we got off.
That's another time.
Yeah, that was when we got off the bus to relieve ourselves, use the restroom.
So what happened then? You went into
Yeah, I went into
hearing or?
No. After that, we went to. I was arrested, got mugged, and was fingerprinted, and I went to the.
Is
that's
the
picture. Yeah, that's the picture. 50 years ago.
That's you, huh?
Yeah, that's me 50 years ago. I'm teased that I was a jailbird.
Yeah, I know about that. Go ahead.
And we were fingerprinted and got our mug shots. And from there, we went to the county jail, and which was fairly decent. And in the county jail, we were mixed with the regular prisoners, and when you had to use the restroom or take a shower, it was facing the door, which had a window in it, which anyone can see what you were doing. So the regular inmates just told us how to have some privacy is to wet some paper towels and put it up at the window, and that would prevent the guards from looking at you. So that was one of the things. The other things, we sung a lot of freedom songs to keep up our morale. And that was the first day. And I think the second day, a lot of people were bailed out. A lot of the women were bailed out. And I think I was left with one or two people. And by that night, I was the only woman left. And I think by that time we were at the city jail. One of them was nicer than the other. I think the last place that I was in of the city jails was very small, and it had insects in it, and I am afraid of insects because I'm a city person. But I got the courage where I wasn't going to be afraid. I didn't want to show any signs of my being frightened of anything. So I learned how to deal with praying mantises and huge spiders and stuff. The place wasn't that good.
It wasn't the Big Six motel.
No, and it was very small. One of the sites was, I think the first day we got there, it was a very small cell, and there was about 6 of us in it, and it looked like it was made for 1 or 2 people. So you had to get accustomed to that, but the way that you got used to it was singing. So it wasn't that bad. But the next day, they transferred us again to a penal farm, where it was a self-contained farm, and like I said, I was a city person. I didn't know how to do any farming. And when we got there, they had to interrogate you, and they also gave you all the rules and regulations. And one of the rules and regulations was you had to say yes, sir, and no, sir. And being 19, I was saying that was one thing I'm not going to say, because I was taught from the time I could remember was that you treat everybody the same, and my parents wanted us to say yes whatever the person's name was, no, but not to say yes, sir, or no, sir, to anyone, nor yes, or no, sir, to anyone, because we all are the same. So I kept that in mind. So the man interrogated me for about 5 or 10 minutes, and I was able to not say yes or no, sir. And I guess he got sort of frustrated and decided that he was going to trip me up. And he turned and he asked me a question. And of course, since he turned to look, I automatically turned and didn't have enough time to say yes, blah, blah, blah. And he slapped me. And he must have been about 6'3" or 4" and weighed about 250. And I was 5'1" and weighed 95 pounds. So I almost got knocked out. I know I blanked out for about a second or two. And I was able to compose myself. And he continued to interrogate me, but I never did follow up again. So he wasn't able to hit me again. So he decided, okay, next person. And the next person was C.T. Vivian, and he slapped him around and blooded his face until he just stopped. Got tired of beating up on someone, because we're all nonviolent. And he called 2 other people and did the same. And the last person he called was Matthew Walker, and Matthew decided that he was going to come up with another tactic. So he would ask him a question, and if it said whatever called for yes or no, he just yesed him to death, no, sir, him to death. So he just got tired of it and did not interview anybody else after that. Someone got out of jail that day. We was bailed out, and he called National Corps to tell them that we were being beaten up in jail. National Corps called the FBI. The FBI sent an agent to come and interview us. They interviewed everybody, including the superintendent. I was bailed out the next day, and the newspaper came out with the headline that the FBI had investigated everything and decided nothing had happened to us. And that was a big education for me too, and I learned that this country would do almost anything to save its face, because I know I was hit. I know what a hit feels like. And I know I saw blood coming out of people's face, noses and things like that. So that is what happened. And when I was bailed out, I flew home, and that was the first time I ever was on an airplane in my life. So they flew me back to New Orleans.
And how did Mama and Papa feel about that?
Oh, my mother, she was happy because
You survived.
I survived, but, excuse me, my dad wasn't, okay, because of my family's activities in New Orleans, my father lost his job. At least they said that they had to lay him off. He was working there for about 20 years, and there were people there who came in after him, but they did not lay them off. But what amounted to, he was laid off because of his children's activities. And he could not find a job in New Orleans, so he went to Colorado and Denver, and that's when he found out that we were involved. So he had called up the day after I gotten home and say, what is this all about? I have to read it in the newspaper that you've been beaten up. I don't want you to be involved in something like this. So I just said, well, Daddy, didn't you tell me when we were coming up that segregation was going to end, and when it comes, we have to participate? And he just stopped and said, well, yes, put your mother on the phone. and then they talked, and then he came back, and I spoke to him again. And then I told him, by the way, Shirley, who is my youngest sister, she is leaving tomorrow to go on a Freedom Rides. And he said, well, she can go. So that was the only inkling, I guess, for someone to be so far away from home and to hear that someone is beating up on your child, you are very alarmed. But at the same time, he supported our being in the movement.
At what point were you able to get together and celebrate some victories?
Well, it was, the victories would just get more and more people involved.
Took a long time.
It took a long time. I think things in New Orleans didn't open up. Well, let me back up. I think there was one cafeteria chain that did start open up allowing blacks to come in to eat, and that was Morrison Cafeteria. So that was a big plus for us. So we used to go there as often as we could to eat there. And I have to say that majority of us were working class families, and we only had X amount of money to spare. So after we would get off a picket line, else come from school or college, we would stop at Morrison Cafeteria and have a iced coffee. It was 25 cents. We could afford that. So that was the victory. But I think New Orleans didn't open up until about 66, or somewhere between 1965 and 1966. And I was living in New York at the time.
And you got to Amherst after New York, spending a few years
No,
there.
I got to Amherst after living in San Francisco for 10 years.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's
Yeah.
a big stretch of time.
Yes.
We're going to have to do this again because this is a work in progress. That's
Yes.
really very, very worth listening to.
Uh-huh.
But let's keep going as long as we can. When did you go to San Francisco?
I went to San Francisco in 1966.
What was in San Francisco for you?
Okay, we have to back up.
Okay.
That's the reason why I love New Orleans. I still would have been in New Orleans. My former husband is Chinese, and Louisiana, as most of the South, and at least a lot of this country, had anti-miscegenation laws. So we couldn't have lived in Louisiana.
It was considered illegal.
Yeah. So I moved to New York, and we got married there. And he was accepted to about 4 or 5 different graduate schools, because he got his master's at City College. It's called City University now, but it was City College of New York City College. And he was also trying to fight the draft, because they wanted to draft him into the Army, which he didn't not want to do. So this is during the time of the Vietnam War.
68,
Yeah.
67.
This was back in '66. Because we were in Vietnam in '63. Well, anyway, he wanted to get into graduate school, and he got his master's in December of '65. So he was looking for graduate schools that would allow him in during the spring of '66, and Berkeley was the only one that was available. So,
Berkeley?
Yes.
He went from the frying pan into the fire, I think.
Yes. So he went to Berkeley. The other one was University of Wisconsin. So we could have gone there, but they didn't accept him after he was accepted at Berkeley. That's where he wanted to go, was to University of Wisconsin, but I'm getting off the subject. So that's how I wound up in California. And I moved to Oakland, from Oakland to San Francisco. And I worked in the anti-war movement, black soldier counseling against anti-war.
During the Vietnam War?
During the Vietnam War. I worked in, when I was in New York, I worked with Brooklyn Corps, the Bronx Corps, and briefly with New York Corps. I preferred the, excuse me.
So were you doing counseling, or were you doing a combination of that and community organizing?
Mainly, some community organizing, mainly counseling. Mainly counseling, community organizing and counseling.
We're going to take a break for a second. I'm talking to Jean Denton, and it's just the opening first chapter, and I'm going to see if we can negotiate a second opportunity after we're done with this first group. Let's go back to New York. What was that like for you in terms of the transition from New Orleans to the north? What was the same and what was different?
What was same, I still had some friends from the movement up there, so I still had, so in that sense, not making friends wasn't that hard. The other thing was looking for work. Since National Corps had some allies with the unions, I was able to get a job in the garment district right away. And I think I got a job in about 2 weeks, which isn't bad. And it was an eye-opener moving from the South to the North to realize that in a lot of ways the North was as segregated as the South. Jobs weren't open to everybody. People worked at certain jobs. I was working at a place where everything was stratified, I guess. You had blacks, some blacks worked in the office, but you didn't have any blacks working in the upper echelon of this place. And majority of the people who worked in the warehouses were either black and blacks from the Caribbean, Puerto Ricans. You didn't see any whites working in the warehouses. The place where my former husband and I lived in was in the Bronx on Gunther Avenue. I think that was the name of the street. Not too far from 233rd East. And we lived with a Jewish family. We had rented an apartment, a studio apartment in our basement. And the three of us were the only non-whites in that little area. So that was New York when I first got there. I was laid off at this job, the first job I got, and I continued to look for jobs in the garment district, and then I branched out, and I went and found a very good job. It was paying much more than the garment district. The person who interviewed me, he and I got along fine. He was ready to say, come in tomorrow, but he said, I have to run you by my supervisor. I went to see the supervisor, and it came back, and you know when somebody does not want you. And that was the end of that job. and it was a big watch company. That's all I would say about it. And the next place I went to about a week later, I went to, this was in 1964, because my husband and I were down to our last $2. Didn't know what we were going to do, because he was a student. And we did get somebody to take us to Atlantic City, if you know what 1964 was. That was the Democratic Convention. So we went to that. And the next day I had a job. I went looking for a job, and I got hired at a big publishing company. And I was one of three people who were of African descent in this place that had 2,300 people working for them. So that was another thing that I learned about New York City. And I was working there for about 6 months, and I ran into some of my ex-Corps workers, and they were asking me, how come you're here on 42nd Street? And I said, oh, I'm on my lunch hour. Oh, you're lying. No, I'm on my lunch hour. Well, where do you work? I said, right across there. They don't hire us there. And I told them, yes, they do. I'm working there. And they refused to believe me, because there were certain places that you could not work at if you were of color in New York City during the 60s. So that was some of the things that I learned.
Jean, it's the beginning. It's not the end. We've got to do more of this stuff. Let's work that out.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it was a pleasure also.
It's a long, long road we've all traveled.
Yes.
And it's good to see you here in town with your wonderful son that I admire greatly.
I admire him too.
Yeah. All right. Until next time, this is Conversations. I'm Isaac BenEzra, host. And we'll see you soon. Good night.